leaves are changing color. Pumpkin spice lattes are back, and Charlie Brown is playing on TV. That must mean it's time for Thanksgiving, with family, friends, and loads of turkey. Even if you're not an American, you've probably heard of the holiday. But the image of pacifist settlers singing Kumbaya alongside the natives is all wrong. The story begins on a cold pier in England in August of 1620, when 120 men, women, and children stepped onto two English merchant ships in Southampton Harbor bound for the Americas. Both vessels seemed to be held together by spit and prayers. The Speedwell was so old it had fought against the Spanish Armada in 1588, and the Mayflower was such an ungainly transport ship that it could barely sail into the wind. And since the North Atlantic in the fall and winter is nothing but westerly winds, it was the absolute worst ship to try and attempt a crossing with. But somehow the Mayflower had made it to the Americas twice before, even if it had taken twice as long as normal. Luckily, these would-be colonists were determined. They had to be. They were Brownists, religious dissenters from the Anglican Church of England. You see, the Brownist beliefs were relatively simple. The first, that only the word of the Holy Bible was infallible. The second, that individual churches and their local communities should have more say and autonomy in the goings-on of the church. Both these beliefs were aimed at jettisoning the corrupt power structure of the old Catholicism. That didn't happen. As the new church started looking more Catholic by the day, the Brownists bought themselves a printing press and began passing out leaflets that opposed it, which led to the Brownists becoming intimately familiar with the inside of London's prison system. They got such a bad rap that Shakespeare even mentions them in one of his plays, Twelfth Night, where he says, "I had as gladly be a Brownist as a politician." Not exactly a flattering comparison. So the Pilgrims decided to risk it all as a startup colony in the Americas, creaky boat and all. It would be an English colony, but one not bound by religious politics. So they set sail and braved the rough fall seas in August of 1620. They hadn't even made it out of the port, though, before they found that the Speedwell was taking on water, so they pulled over in Dartmouth for repairs. Undaunted, they shored the leaking boards and set out again, to a new life, and watched with glee as Land's End and Cornwall slipped away behind them, only to turn around and immediately see it again. The Speedwell had recently been refitted with a larger mast, and somebody had clearly botched the job. The ship was going nowhere. So 20 people agreed to stay behind and bring more of their congregation with them the next year, and 102 crammed onto the already overloaded Mayflower, finally leaving again on the 6th of September. Or maybe it was the 16th, no one's actually sure, the calendars in that period are a bit wonky. Their trip was mercifully dull after recent events, but halfway across the ocean, the Pilgrims' good luck set back in again. A storm and strong winds hit. In the middle of the storm, a deep snap echoed through the ship. A main beam had cracked. So they pulled a spare from the hold and tried to reinforce it, but the buckling was so severe that it wouldn't stay in place. That meant it was time to turn around and go back to England. Again. The delays had already exhausted all the Pilgrims' money, and for them, that wasn't an option. So they decided to try something else first. They had brought a great iron screw with them as cargo, likely a piece of the exact printing press that had gotten them kicked out of England in the first place, and used that to raise the new beam into place. Somehow, it held long enough to get them across the Atlantic. They sighted land on 9th November, just off Cape Cod, then turned south for the Hudson River Valley, hoping to move closer to established colonies and warm weather. But hard winter currents forced them back to Massachusetts, where they set up anchor in the natural harbor of Provincetown. Knowing that their previous claim on this new land had been dodgy at best, the settlers agreed to draw up a new contract for their colony, styling it the Mayflower Compact. It organized them as a civil body politic, created for the general good of the colony, where issues would be decided by vote. This set of rules and beliefs set down by the Pilgrims has since been called the world's first written constitution. The men of the ship put their names to paper, and they all signed the agreement together. And within weeks, they would all begin dying together. Scurvy and illness took hold of the boat, and as the first snows arrived, it turned the ship into an icy tomb. Exploration parties were sent out to find a suitable place to build, and any man who could still stand was put aboard with swords, armor, and matchlocks. They found a deserted landscape and found themselves strangers in an unknown land, filled with native burials and abandoned villages. But everywhere they went, eyes watched them. Going as far as they could each day, they camped on the shores, and in the dim morning, they draped their jackets over a barricade to dry, and made to move their boats back into the water. And that's when the arrows began to rain down on them. Grabbing muskets, they fired blindly into the forest. Their leader appeared from behind a tree and fired 3 arrows directly at the pilgrims. The man gave a triumphant cry and then disappeared again into the forest. The pilgrims searched the area, but found no bodies. Only 18 arrows, tipped with deer horn, brass, and eagle's claws. When they went to retrieve their jackets, they found them riddled with arrow holes. Guessing that as many as 30 or 40 men waited for them in the forest, the pilgrims left before they could return. The next day, they found the building place they were looking for, well suited to winter construction, already cleared of timber, with tall hills for defensive positions. But it was also full of dead bodies. Patuxet had been a village of the Wampanoag people, until it had been wiped out by an outbreak of Indian fever 3 years earlier. The epidemic was bad enough that the colonists found unburied skeletons still inside their homes. But with more settlers dying by the second, the pilgrims were in no shape to be picky. They moved the Mayflower to join them and began construction. The first common house that was finished became a hospital for the ill, and the 19 families then each built their own town, huddled together for defense, and by February, the settlement was complete. But without food or proper shelter, they continued to die off one by one by one. And by the time the snows thawed, only 47 of the original 102 pilgrims were still alive, and half of the Mayflower crew had died as well. Those that survived now faced the danger of summer raiding parties, so they decided to fortify the village, bringing cannons from the ship to point outwards into the unknown wilds. Finally free of the bitter cold, they planted corn taken from the abandoned graves and storehouses of the old Wampanoag village. And with that first thaw came their first contact with the locals. A man, tall and dark-skinned, boldly strode out of the forest and made to walk directly into the center of their town. The pilgrims stopped him, guns pointed. Then he opened his mouth and greeted them in English, welcoming them to the new land, and then promptly asked for a beer to drink. He was Samoset of the eastern Abenaki, who'd spent years trading tales and supplies with English fishermen who passed through the area. And as he swapped stories over his acquired taste for English delicacies, he warned that not every tribe would be as friendly as his, but they could get little more out of him as his English was broken at best. The next week, Samoset returned with a new man, Tisquantum, known today as Squanto, who spoke fluent English. He was the last survivor of the Patuxet tribe, the very land the pilgrims now inhabited, who had been taken by slavers as a boy and had lived in Spain and England before escaping back home again, only to find his own people had been wiped out by disease. He had been taken captive, a useful tool to deal with the continuing English encroachment. Squanto heralded the arrival of 60 armed warriors and their chief, the Wampanoag. The pilgrims grabbed their muskets and ran to the walls and waited for the worst. But neither side wanted to make the first move. With a bit of back and forth from Squanto, their chief, Massasoit, agreed to sit down with the pilgrims' governor, and after a healthy amount of liquor to loosen up both sides, they set about with the business of peace. See, the Wampanoag found themselves beset on all sides by enemy tribes, with plenty of land, but no power to hold them back. Where others saw the English settlers as a threat, Massasoit saw an opportunity. The pilgrims agreed to help the chief against his enemies by using their muskets and cannons, in return for mutual protection, and some much-needed agricultural advice from Squanto, specifically how to plant the native foods that the pilgrims had never before encountered. And so began an unlikely friendship, where Squanto passed on his knowledge of the land. Under his tutelage, the pilgrims learned how to plant corn, bean, and squash in a way that ensured that each would thrive. When they weren't planting, they sent diplomatic parties out to every tribe in a 50-mile radius to agree to mutual peace, and took time to knock the heads of anyone who threatened their native allies. So by the time the fall came and the harvest ready to be brought in, they found themselves looking quite optimistically to the new year, especially in comparison to the last. It was in this spirit that the men were sent into the forest to shoot a few game birds, likely turkeys and waterfowl, for a feast to give thanks to the Lord for their bounty and good luck. Massasoit joined them with 90 of his people and brought along 5 deer for the occasion. Add to that a few eels, some fish, crabs, and a lobster or two, and of course their freshly harvested corns, beans, and squash, and you got yourself the first Thanksgiving dinner. It was a celebration that lasted for 3 days, a harvest festival with sport, games, and friends, like so many others around the world. Days of Thanksgiving, thankful that there will be enough food to eat, and another year survived. Sure, the new land wasn't perfect. It wasn't harmony between man and beast, or a permanent peace between settler and native. But for a time, people set aside their differences and gave their thanks for a chance at life. And many other harvest festivals appear around the world today for just the same thing. And that's the story of the first Thanksgiving.